The crystal chandeliers of the Vandermeer Hotel ballroom cast a golden glow over 300 guests at exactly 9:47 p.m., the kind of light that makes champagne look like liquid amber and transforms silk gowns into pools of shimmering color. The orchestra was playing something elegant and forgettable, the kind of music that exists only to fill the spaces between conversation and the soft clink of glasses. Perfume mingled with the heavy scent of lilies arranged in towering vases throughout the room, creating an atmosphere so thick with wealth you could almost taste it on your tongue. Natalie Richford stood near the marble columns by the exit, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the elaborate gowns swirling around her. Her hands were steady at her sides, no trembling, no fidgeting, even though every single person in that ballroom had turned to watch her. And 30 feet away, near the dessert table laden with gold leaf pastries and chocolate fountains, her husband Marcus stood laughing with a woman Natalie had never been formally introduced to but whose perfume she'd smelled on his shirts for the past 2 years. They looked so comfortable together, his hand resting possessively on the small of the woman's back, both of them smiling like they shared the most delicious secret in the world. The guests waited. They all waited. They were watching Natalie with the kind of anticipation you see in people's faces right before a car crash, that horrible mix of concern and excitement, knowing something terrible is about to happen and being unable to look away. Then Marcus's business partner, a man with silver hair and a smile that never reached his cold blue eyes, approached the small stage where the band had been playing. He held a microphone in one hand like a weapon, and that smile stretched wider as he tapped it twice, sending feedback squealing through the ballroom. The music stopped. Every conversation died mid-sentence. 300 faces turned toward the stage, then toward Natalie, then back to the stage again. "Ladies and gentlemen," the man announced, his voice dripping with false warmth, "we have a special surprise this evening for our devoted wife, Natalie." The way he said devoted made it sound like an insult, like a joke everyone was in on except her. "Marcus has an important announcement to make about his future. Their future, rather." He paused, letting the anticipation build, feeding off the gasps that were already starting to ripple through the crowd. As of tonight, Marcus Whitfield is filing for divorce. And in his incredible generosity, he wants to handle this publicly so there are no misunderstandings about how this marriage really was. Gasps turned into whispers, whispers turned into murmurs, and at least a dozen phones rose into the air, recording, capturing, preserving this moment for social media immortality. Natalie felt rage building in her chest like a wildfire, hot and consuming, but her face remained perfectly calm. She knew what Marcus wanted. He wanted tears. He wanted begging. He wanted her to fall apart in front of everyone, so he could play the role of the patient husband, finally pushed to his limit by an unstable, difficult wife. Marcus's lawyer materialized beside her like he'd been waiting in the shadows. He was a thin man in an expensive suit, the kind that costs more than most people's monthly rent, and he held a stack of papers in his manicured hands. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, "these are your divorce papers. I think you'll find the terms quite clear." He handed them to her, and Natalie took them because refusing would have caused a scene, and she wasn't ready for that yet. She scanned the first page, her trained eye catching the highlights even as her hands refused to shake. She got nothing. Not the house her grandmother had left her, the one with the garden where she'd spent childhood summers. Not her late father's company that she'd poured 5 years of her life into saving. Not a single dollar from the accounts she'd foolishly let Marcus convince her to merge for simplicity. The woman standing beside Marcus, the one laughing just moments ago, stepped forward into the light, and Natalie finally saw her clearly. Celeste Brennan. That was her name. And hanging around Celeste's neck, catching the chandelier light and throwing it back in brilliant flashes, was Natalie's grandmother's emerald necklace, the one that had been in her family for 4 generations. Suddenly, like a door opening in her mind, Natalie remembered. The papers she'd signed last year, the ones Marcus said were just routine business documents, tax forms that needed her signature as a company director. Her throat went tight. Her mind raced backward through 18 months of small moments she'd dismissed. His unusual interest in her schedule, his insistence on handling all the legal paperwork, his casual questions about her family assets that she'd answered without thinking. He'd been planning this. Every signature, every document, every routine, platform had been a trap slowly closing. Marcus stepped forward then, and the crowd parted for him like he was royalty. Security guards positioned themselves at strategic points around Natalie. She counted 4 of them, all watching her with that particular alertness of people expecting trouble. Marcus's face was arranged in an expression of gentle concern that must have taken practice to perfect. In his hand, he held a check, and he made sure everyone could see it as he approached. "Natalie," he said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom, pitched perfectly for the recording phones. "I know this is difficult, but I want to be fair. Here's $50,000 to help you get started on your own. All you have to do is sign the papers and leave quietly. I've supported you long enough, and I think we both know this is for the best." The crowd formed a tighter circle, every phone angled toward her face, waiting for the breakdown. Waiting for the tears, the screaming, the begging that would make such perfect content, such a perfect story they could share over brunch tomorrow about the poor, unstable wife who couldn't handle her marriage ending. Natalie's sister Emma was pushing through the crowd, her face streaked with tears, reaching out, but 2 of Marcus's friends blocked her path with their bodies, all smiles and fake apologies about the crowding. The orchestra hadn't started playing again. 300 people stood in complete, suffocating silence. Natalie's throat was tight, and she could taste copper in her mouth from where she'd bitten the inside of her cheek to keep her expression neutral. The pain helped. It gave her something to focus on besides the humiliation, besides the rage, besides the urge to scream until her voice gave out. Natalie looked down at the divorce papers in her hands, her eyes scanning the words without really reading them. Then she looked up, directly at Marcus, and for just a moment, she let him see the truth in her eyes. Not defeat, not devastation, something else entirely, something that made his smile falter for just a fraction of a second. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She didn't beg or scream or fall to her knees like he'd clearly scripted in his head. Instead, she reached into the small black clutch she'd been holding all night, her movements deliberate and calm. Her fingers found the single folded document she'd placed there 3 hours ago, back when she'd still thought she might lose her nerve. But standing here now, with 300 people watching and Marcus looking so certain of his victory, she felt nothing but clarity. She walked to the gift table, that elaborate display of wrapped boxes and envelopes that guests had brought to celebrate 6 years of marriage, and she placed her document right in the center, smoothing it carefully. Then she turned toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor in the silence, each step echoing like a countdown. Her back was straight, her head high, and she didn't look back once. Behind her, she could hear the confusion starting, voices rising in questions. Marcus's voice cut through. "Wait, what is?" But she was already at the door. And as her hand touched the brass handle, she heard it. The sound of that document unfolding on the table, paper rustling as someone opened it. The gasp that followed. The single word someone whispered that carried across the entire ballroom. "Federal investigation? Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. But before you do, if you're feeling what Natalie's feeling right now, hit that subscribe button for Olivia the Storyteller. Because what happens next? Let's just say Marcus thought he had one. He had no idea what she'd been preparing. And if you don't subscribe, at least tell us in the comments why you're choosing to miss the most satisfying revenge story of the year. Drop fire if you're already hooked. But to understand how Natalie Richford became the woman who could walk out of that ballroom with her head high while Marcus Whitfield's world crumbled behind her, you need to know how she got there in the first place. 6 years earlier, when she was just 28 years old, Natalie wasn't standing in a ballroom wearing a simple black dress. She was standing in her late father's office at Richford Solutions, surrounded by stacks of financial statements that all told the same devastating story. Bankruptcy was coming, and she had maybe 3 months to stop it. Her father, Richard, had died of a massive heart attack 4 months prior, collapsing at his desk on a Tuesday afternoon, and the company he'd built over 30 years was dying with him. Natalie had been working 18-hour days ever since, trying to understand accounting systems she'd never needed to learn, calling in favors from people who stopped returning her calls after the second attempt, begging banks for loans they refused to give a grieving daughter with no business degree and no experience running a manufacturing company. The coffee she drank was always too hot because she never waited for it to cool, burning her tongue and the roof of her mouth daily, adding to the collection of paper cuts on her fingers from endless document sorting. The fluorescent lights hummed constantly, a sound that burrowed into her skull during the long nights when she couldn't go home because home felt too empty without her father's voice on the phone asking how her day went. 47 employees depended on her, most of them people who'd worked with her father for decades, people who'd watched her grow up, who'd brought casseroles to the funeral and told her they believed in her. She hadn't slept in her own bed in 3 weeks, instead passing out on the leather couch in her father's office, waking up with her cheek pressed against financial reports and her neck screaming in pain. That's when Marcus Whitfield walked through the door. He was 35, successful in private equity, and he'd been referred by someone her father had called a friend, though Natalie had never met Marcus before that afternoon. He was charming in a way that felt effortless, his suit perfectly tailored, his smile warm but professional, and when he shook her hand, he held it just a moment longer than necessary while looking directly into her exhausted eyes and saying, "I'd like to help you save this." He explained that he specialized in turning around struggling companies, that he saw potential in Richford solutions that others were too short-sighted to recognize, but he needed to understand the business intimately before making any commitments. So he started coming to the office, spending hours reviewing operations, sitting in on meetings, taking Natalie to business dinners where he'd ask thoughtful questions about her father's vision and her own hopes for the company's future. She was too exhausted to see the red flags, too desperate to question why someone this successful and polished would spend so much time on a company this small and troubled. 12 other investors had already rejected her proposals, and Marcus was the first person in months who'd made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could actually pull this off. 3 months later, Marcus invested $2 million, and the company stabilized almost overnight. Vendors got paid, employees stopped whispering about updating their resumes, and Natalie finally slept for more than 4 hours in a row. Marcus was there for all of it, supportive and present, celebrating each small victory with her like he genuinely cared. Then came the board meeting on a Thursday in September, 47 days after his investment cleared. They were reviewing quarterly projections that actually looked hopeful for the first time in a year, and right there, in front of 8 board members and her father's former business partners, Marcus stood up and proposed. Not a business proposal. Marriage. He had a ring. He had a speech about how he'd fallen in love with her strength and determination, and he had perfect timing because everyone in that room started applauding before Natalie could even process what was happening. Her mother, who'd been invited to observe the meeting as a courtesy since she owned shares through her late husband, was crying with joy, actually crying, because she'd been so worried about Natalie being alone and overwhelmed. Refusing would have made Natalie look ungrateful, cold, insane even. But somewhere deep in her gut, beneath the exhaustion and the gratitude and the relief, something whispered that this didn't feel right. The wedding planning happened at lightning speed, just 4 months from proposal to ceremony. Marcus insisted on handling all the boring legal stuff so she could focus on getting the company fully back on track, and that seemed reasonable, even generous. The prenuptial agreement he presented was thick, official-looking, full of legal language that made her eyes cross after 18-hour workdays. His lawyer was there at the signing, champagne already poured, Marcus's hand warm on her shoulder as he said it protected both of them, that it was just a formality, that he trusted her completely and hoped she trusted him. She signed without reading every page carefully because the company was finally profitable again, because 47 people still had jobs, because her mother was planning the wedding her father would have wanted to see, and because she was so tired of fighting everything alone. The taste of victory was intoxicating enough to drown out that whisper of doubt. The wedding day arrived with 200 guests, held at the venue her mother had dreamed about since Natalie was a little girl, everything perfect and beautiful and overwhelming. When Marcus whispered his vows, his lips close to her ear, he said, "Everything I have is yours," and it sounded like a promise, like safety, like the end of struggling alone. But his eyes flickered, just for a moment, toward his lawyer standing in the crowd with a satisfied smile. Natalie's grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, something she'd said 1,000 times when Natalie was young. "Never sign what you don't read, sweetheart. Never." Later, when Natalie finally looked at the marriage certificate and the attached documents, she realized company shares had been transferred, that she'd signed away more than she understood. She told herself she was being paranoid, that marriage meant sharing everything anyway, that Marcus had saved her father's company and she owed him trust. She told herself a lot of things that night. None of them were true. Comment A if you've ever ignored a red flag because you wanted to believe someone, or B if you've always trusted your gut. Either way, you need to subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller because what Marcus does next makes this look like child's play. And for those who won't subscribe, tell us in the comments what's holding you back. We genuinely want to know. Drop fire if you're already feeling the dread building. 2 years into the marriage, the changes started so subtly that Natalie almost didn't notice them happening. Or maybe she noticed but told herself it was normal, that this was just how corporate restructuring worked, how marriages evolved when both partners were focused on building something bigger than themselves. Marcus was now CEO of what he called their company, though the letterhead no longer read Richford Solutions. It read Whitfield Solutions, her father's name erased as cleanly as if it had never existed, replaced with Marcus's in bold letters that somehow looked more official, more serious, more successful. Natalie had been moved to the advisory board, a title that sounded important but meant she spent most of her time in a smaller office on the 3rd floor instead of the executive suite where her father had worked for 30 years, where she'd saved 47 jobs during those desperate 18-hour days that felt like a lifetime ago. Her new office had harsh fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly sickly, and the coffee from the break room always tasted bitter no matter how much cream she added. Dinner at home had become silent affairs where Marcus scrolled through his phone and she picked at food she could barely taste, both of them pretending this was fine. This was normal. This was what successful couples looked like. The employees she'd saved, the ones who'd worked with her father and promised they believed in her, now reported to Marcus's people, new hires with business degrees and cold efficiency who looked at her with polite confusion when she tried to discuss projects she'd once managed. Marcus started traveling constantly, gone 3 weeks out of every month for business opportunities he explained in vague terms that sounded impressive but meant nothing. When he returned, he smelled different, like a floral perfume she'd never worn, something expensive and cloying that clung to his shirts even after they'd been laundered. Her credit cards started getting declined at random times. Once at the grocery store while she was buying ingredients for a dinner he wouldn't be home to eat, the cashier's pitying expression burning into her memory as she fumbled for a different card that also declined. Marcus explained it away as restructuring their finances, a temporary freeze while he moved assets around for better tax advantages, and his tone suggested she was being difficult by asking questions about her own money. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, that same advice she'd been giving Natalie since childhood. Marriage requires sacrifice, sweetheart. Compromise. You can't expect everything to stay the same. Natalie noticed her friends from before the marriage had stopped calling, but when she mentioned it to Marcus, he reminded her gently that he'd always thought they were toxic, that they'd been jealous of her success, that she was better off without people who didn't support their marriage. Then the bank statement arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and Natalie sat at her small desk staring at numbers that didn't make sense. Their joint account, the one that should have held over $300,000, showed a balance of $812. When she called Marcus, her hands shaking, he sounded annoyed that she'd bothered him during a meeting. It was an investment opportunity, he explained, something time-sensitive that required immediate capital, and he hadn't wanted to bother her with the details since she'd been so stressed lately. The way he said stressed made it sound like a character flaw, like evidence of her inability to handle adult responsibilities. That same week, Natalie discovered that her grandmother's house, the one left specifically to her in a will that had been crystal clear, now had Marcus listed as co-owner on the deed. The legal documents she'd signed last year, the ones he'd said were just for tax purposes, had actually transferred half the property to him. Her sister Emma drove over that night after Natalie called her crying, and Emma held her hands across the kitchen table and said, "You need to leave him. This isn't normal. This is abuse." But Natalie heard herself defending Marcus, explaining how hard he worked, how much pressure he was under, how she'd probably misunderstood the documents. The taste of shame was bitter in her mouth, the realization that she'd become that woman, the one who makes excuses, who can't admit she's made a terrible mistake. The 4th anniversary was approaching, and Marcus mentioned he was planning a surprise party, something special to celebrate how far they'd come together. Natalie accidentally overheard a phone call one afternoon when she came home early from her meaningless advisory board position. Marcus was in his home office, door cracked open, laughing with someone in a way she hadn't heard him laugh in years. The name Celeste came up 3 times, and the tone was intimate, familiar, the tone of someone who knows another person's body as well as their thoughts. She started finding things after that. Once she knew to look: hotel receipts from cities where he claimed to be staying with clients, restaurant charges for 2 at romantic places she'd never been, jewelry purchases for amounts that made her stomach turn because she'd never received any jewelry from Marcus except her wedding ring. When she finally gathered the courage to confront him, keeping her voice gentle and non-accusatory because she was afraid of what would happen if she pushed too hard, he turned it back on her so skillfully she almost believed him. She was paranoid. She was seeing things that weren't there. He was working hard for their future, and instead of appreciation, he got accusations. She was becoming difficult, impossible to please, and maybe she needed to talk to someone about her anxiety. The security system he installed the next week was supposedly for her safety, but Natalie noticed all the cameras pointed inward, toward the rooms where she spent her time, never toward the doors and windows where an actual intruder might enter. She discovered she'd been locked out of the company email system when she tried to check on a project she'd initiated years ago, back when the company still felt like hers. Marcus's assistant, who used to be her assistant, wouldn't return her calls, and when Natalie drove to the office unannounced, security stopped her at the front desk and politely informed her she needed an appointment to go beyond the lobby. The legal letter arrived on a Friday, informing her she was being removed from the advisory board effective immediately due to restructuring. Her signature was at the bottom of documents she'd never seen, let alone signed, her handwriting forged well enough that she almost doubted her own memory. Every paper she'd signed in 6 years of marriage had been a trap, each one tightening around her like invisible chains. That night, unable to sleep, she heard Marcus on the phone in his office at 2 a.m, his voice low but clear through the walls. "The anniversary party will handle everything. Trust me, she'll be completely manageable by then. How many of you have watched someone lose themselves piece by piece? Drop your country below. If this story is making your blood boil, smash that subscribe button for Olivia the Storyteller, because Natalie's about to do something Marcus never saw coming. And if you're not subscribing, at least comment why. We want to understand what's stopping you from joining this community. Type yes if you want justice for Natalie." 3 months before that anniversary party where everything would change, Natalie started doing something she'd never done before. She started keeping records. Not the vague mental notes she'd been making for years, the ones she dismissed as paranoia or stress, but actual documentation. Screenshots of bank statements before they disappeared. Photos of documents Marcus left carelessly on his desk. Recordings of conversations where he contradicted himself. She kept everything on a laptop she bought with cash, hidden in her car, parked in different locations every night while she compiled evidence of her own life falling apart. The night she met Theodore Kavinsky, her father's old lawyer, she chose a coffee shop 40 minutes from home, a place where nobody would recognize either of them. The coffee smelled burnt, the rain outside made visibility pour through the fogged windows, and her hands shook so badly that paper rustled audibly when she handed him the folder she'd prepared. Kavinsky was 73 years old, retired for 5 years, but he'd agreed to meet her as a favor to her father's memory. He opened the folder, and Natalie watched his face go pale in the harsh fluorescent lighting, watched him flip through page after page with increasing horror. When he finally looked up at her, his voice came out as a whisper, even though they were alone in a corner booth. "This is sophisticated financial abuse. Everything's been transferred. You own nothing." Kavinsky explained it to her over 2 hours and 3 cups of that terrible coffee, his voice patient but grim as he walked her through what Marcus had done. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed without reading carefully wasn't just protective, it was predatory, designed to give Marcus everything in the event of divorce, including assets she'd brought into the marriage like her inheritance and her father's company. The company's shares had been transferred through documents buried in routine paperwork, the kind of thing she'd signed dozens of times thinking they were standard operational forms. Her grandmother's house, the one she'd signed over temporarily for estate planning purposes that Marcus said would save her thousands in taxes, was now legally his property with no mechanism for her to reclaim it. Kavinsky did the math right there on a napkin, his handwriting shaky with age and anger, and the final number was devastating. In the eyes of the law, Natalie Richford had legal right to approximately $0. Worse than that, the $2 million Marcus had initially invested in saving her father's company was technically structured as a loan to her personally, which meant in divorce proceedings, she would actually owe him $2 million she didn't have and could never hope to earn. Then Kavinsky told her something that made the burnt coffee taste like acid in her throat. Marcus had done this before. Not once, but twice. 2 previous wives, 2 previous anniversary parties, the exact same pattern playing out like a script Marcus had perfected through repetition. Both women had left their marriages broken and penniless, their reputations destroyed in whisper campaigns that painted them as gold diggers who'd married successful men and couldn't handle the pressure of high society life. One of them, a woman named Jennifer, had tried to fight legally, and she'd ended up owing Marcus's legal fees on top of everything else, nearly $200,000 that bankrupted her completely. The local press had covered both divorces with headlines that made Natalie's stomach turn. Another failed marriage for successful investor. Wife's instability forces difficult decision. Whitfield moves forward after tumultuous split. Natalie could taste bile rising in her throat as she realized she'd been marked from day one. Selected and hunted and trapped with the precision of someone who'd done this enough times to know exactly which buttons to push and which documents to hide in plain sight. Kavinsky wanted to fight, his old lawyer's instincts kicking in despite his retirement, but he was honest about the odds. Marcus's legal team was vicious, well-connected to judges and prosecutors throughout the county, willing to destroy anyone who challenged their client publicly. A case like this would take 3 to 5 years of litigation that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars Natalie didn't have, and there was no guarantee she'd win. Her sister Emma had already maxed out 3 credit cards trying to help Natalie afford an initial legal consultation with a different firm, a consultation that had ended with the lawyer politely declining to take the case because Marcus's reputation made it too risky. Natalie's mother was still defending Marcus, still insisting that Natalie must have done something wrong to push such a generous man to this point, still suggesting that maybe if Natalie had been a better wife, none of this would be happening. The social circle Natalie thought she'd built over 6 years had evaporated the moment she'd started asking uncomfortable questions, and she'd realized with painful clarity that they'd never been her friends at all. They'd always been Marcus's friends, people who smiled at her because she came attached to him. The security cameras in the house meant she couldn't even cry privately without wondering if Marcus was watching, analyzing, documenting her breakdowns as evidence of the instability he'd need to justify everything he was about to do. When Natalie returned home that night, exhausted and terrified and more alone than she'd felt since her father died, she found Marcus's calendar open on his desk. He'd gotten careless, or maybe he just didn't think she was smart enough or strong enough to do anything with the information. The anniversary party invitation list was there, complete with business partners, members of the press, society photographers who specialized in capturing dramatic moments for magazines that wealthy people read over brunch. In the margin, in Marcus's distinctive handwriting, was a note that made her blood run cold. Public divorce announcement. Maximum humiliation. A separate sticky note, partially hidden under the calendar, said simply, "See gets the necklace that night. Celeste." Her grandmother's emerald necklace, a family heirloom worth more in sentimental value than money, and Marcus was planning to give it to his mistress the same night he destroyed Natalie in front of everyone they knew. She had 12 weeks to do something impossible, to find a way out of a trap that had been built so carefully that even experienced lawyers thought it was unbeatable. Natalie walked to the bathroom, turned on the light, and looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection looked different than it had that morning. Not broken, not defeated, something else. Something calculating and cold and absolutely done with being the victim in someone else's story. Where in the world are you watching this unfold? Drop your location. If you're feeling that fire building in your chest right now, subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller, because what Natalie does in the next 12 weeks will blow your mind. And to everyone not subscribing, seriously, comment below and tell us what's making you hesitate. We want to know. Drop fire if you want Marcus to pay for this. 10 weeks before the anniversary party that would change everything, Natalie started spending her afternoons at the public library downtown, the old one with the tall windows and the smell of aging paper that reminded her of her father's study. She couldn't use the computers at home because Marcus had monitoring software on everything. She discovered that 3 days after her meeting with Kavinsky, when she tested it by searching for divorce lawyers, and found the search history mysteriously cleared but Marcus's questions that evening oddly specific. So the library became her war room, her planning headquarters, the place where she spread out books on financial fraud and forensic accounting and corporate law across a table in the back corner where the afternoon sunlight made everything feel almost hopeful. The sensory details of those days became a kind of meditation. The smell of old books and dust, the scratch of pencil on paper as she took notes in handwriting she disguised in case someone saw, the terrible coffee from the vending machine that somehow tasted better than the expensive stuff at home, the fluorescent buzz that kicked in when the sun set and she realized she'd been there for 6 hours straight. She created an encrypted email account using the library's computers, following instructions from a privacy forum she'd found, routing it through servers in 3 different countries because she was learning to think like someone who had something to hide. At home, her performance was Oscar-worthy, the perfect wife, increasingly depressed and dependent, taking the pills Marcus gave her but palming half of them, acting sedated enough that he stopped watching her quite so carefully. The research led her down rabbit holes that made her previous understanding of Marcus's crimes look almost quaint. His pattern involved offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and shell companies with names like Redwood Capital Holdings and Sapphire Investment Group that sounded legitimate but existed only on paper. She contacted a forensic accountant named Janet Holloway through her encrypted email, a woman who specialized in unraveling exactly this kind of financial maze, and Janet agreed to investigate quietly with payment deferred until after the case was resolved, if it ever was. What Janet found over the next 3 weeks made Natalie's hands shake so badly she had to set down her coffee. Marcus had diverted $4.7 million in company profits over 5 years, money that should have gone to Richford Solutions but had instead flowed through those shell companies into accounts Natalie couldn't access. The original $2 million investment that had saved the company? It had actually come from the company itself, routed through Marcus's accounts in a circular fraud scheme that meant he'd never risked a single dollar of his own money. The paper trail Janet uncovered showed systematic theft going back to within 3 months of the wedding, every quarter showing profits quietly siphoned away, while Natalie had been grateful for his business expertise keeping them afloat. Then Janet found something that made everything click into place with horrible clarity. Celeste Brennan wasn't just Marcus's mistress. She was his business partner and had been for 12 years. They'd run this exact scheme in 3 different cities targeting 5 different women before Natalie, and the pattern was identical every time. Marcus would identify a vulnerable woman with assets, court her, marry her, systematically transfer everything, then execute a public humiliation at an anniversary party before moving to the next location and starting over. Celeste's role was crucial because she befriended the wives early, gaining their trust, before revealing herself as the other woman at the perfectly timed moment for maximum emotional devastation. Natalie pulled up photos from the company Christmas party 4 years ago and found Celeste in the background of 3 pictures, smiling at the camera, already there, already watching, already planning. The entire 6-year relationship had been a con from the first handshake, and Natalie had to sit in the library bathroom for 20 minutes, trying not to throw up as she realized just how thoroughly she'd been played. Janet's evidence was solid, but came with a warning that made Natalie's hope falter. They covered their tracks extremely well enough that standard legal channels would take years to untangle, years Marcus would use to move more assets offshore and hide them beyond reach. He was already moving money. Janet's analysis showed transfers accelerating over the past month, suggesting he was anticipating potential investigation and preparing contingencies. The window of opportunity was closing faster than Natalie could work. Her sister Emma offered her entire savings, $23,000 scraped together from years of teaching elementary school, and Natalie cried when Emma transferred it because it was everything her sister had and it still wasn't even close to enough to fight Marcus's legal team. Meanwhile, Marcus started casually mentioning the anniversary party in conversation, his tone light and almost affectionate as he said things like, "So many people coming to support us, and it's going to be a night nobody forgets," his eyes holding hers just long enough that she knew he was testing to see if she suspected anything. 8 weeks before the party, Marcus brought Celeste to the house for what he called a business dinner. Natalie cooked, played hostess, smiled until her face hurt, and when Celeste touched her hand with fake sympathy and said, "You look so tired lately, are you taking care of yourself?" Natalie recognized the perfume immediately. It was the same scent she'd smelled on Marcus's clothes for years, the one she'd convinced herself meant nothing, the one that had been there since before they were even married, because Celeste had been part of the plan from the very beginning. After dinner, Natalie excused herself to get dessert and found them in Marcus's office, sitting close together, laughing at something on Celeste's laptop screen. The angle was just right for Natalie to see the spreadsheet clearly, its header reading, Asset Distribution Post-N, with columns showing properties, accounts, and projected values. They didn't even notice her standing there. They were that confident, that certain of their victory. Natalie walked away calmly, went to the bathroom, closed the door, and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes of silent rage where she gripped the sink so hard her knuckles went white and tears of fury streamed down her face. Then she washed her face, reapplied her makeup, and went back downstairs to serve dessert with a smile that felt like a weapon. Comment your continent right now. If you're feeling what Natalie's feeling, you need to hit subscribe for Olivia the Storyteller because this plan she's building, it's going to be beautiful. And for those refusing to subscribe, at least tell us why in the comments. What's making you hesitate to join 50,000 others on this justice journey? Drop fire if you want to see Marcus and Celeste get what they deserve. 6 weeks before the anniversary party, Natalie made a decision that could either save her or destroy what little she had left. She contacted Victor Remington, an investigative journalist whose specialty was exposing corporate fraud in the kind of high society circles where people pretended everyone played by the rules. His office was in a building downtown with glass walls that overlooked the city skyline, and when Natalie arrived at dusk, the purple sky behind the buildings made everything look like a movie scene about someone planning something dangerous. She handed him 73 pages of documentation that represented weeks of library research, Janet's forensic accounting reports, screenshots of bank transfers, and timelines that connected Marcus to patterns of fraud going back over a decade. The coffee Victor had poured for both of them went cold as he read. Traffic noise filtering up from the street below, his leather chair creaking, every time he shifted to look at a new page. Natalie watched his face carefully, saw the moment his expression changed from professional interest to genuine shock, heard his sharp intake of breath when he reached the page showing the circular fraud scheme. When he finally looked up at her, his first words were cautious. Marcus Whitfield is extremely well connected. If we go after him and miss, this could get very ugly for both of us. Natalie's voice came out steadier than she felt. It already is ugly, Victor. I'm just making it visible. Victor sat back in his chair and admitted something that made Natalie realize she wasn't as alone as she thought. He'd been watching Marcus for 2 years, ever since receiving an anonymous tip from someone who claimed to be a previous victim. The first wife, the one named Jennifer that Kavinsky had mentioned, had attempted suicide 6 months after her public divorce humiliation. She'd survived, barely, but the trauma had been so severe that she refused to testify or speak publicly about what Marcus had done. The second wife had left the country entirely, living somewhere in Europe under a different name, too terrified to fight or even acknowledge what had happened to her. Both women had signed NDAs as part of their divorce settlements, legal documents that prevented them from speaking about Marcus or the circumstances of their marriages under threat of financial penalties they could never afford to pay. Marcus's legal team had unlimited budget and a reputation for absolutely destroying anyone who dared speak up against their client, and Victor had watched case after case disappear into legal limbo or get settled with brutal NDA terms. But Natalie was different, Victor said, leaning forward with something like hope in his eyes. She had evidence. She had a timeline. And most importantly, she had nothing left to lose, which made her dangerous in a way the other women hadn't been. Then Victor opened his desk drawer and pulled out something that made Natalie's entire understanding of Marcus shift into an even darker territory. They were sealed court records that Victor had obtained through sources he wouldn't name, and they show that Marcus hadn't just done this marriage con 5 times. He'd done it in corporate form too, targeting 12 small business owners over the same 12-year period. The method was identical: invest in struggling companies, gain the owner's trust, transfer assets through legal documents buried in routine paperwork, then leave them with massive debt while Marcus walked away with everything valuable. 3 of the victims were men, 9 were women, and all of them had been left financially ruined with no legal recourse because everything Marcus did was technically legal, just morally bankrupt. One man had lost a family farm that had been in his family for 4 generations, land his great-grandfather had bought with money saved from 40 years of factory work. Victor's research showed total estimated theft of $47 million over 12 years, and those were just the cases he could document. There were probably others who'd been too ashamed or too afraid to leave any kind of paper trail. Victor agreed to investigate and publish, but he needed ironclad proof, the kind that would stand up not just in court, but in the court of public opinion. The evidence Natalie had was strong but still circumstantial in places, and Marcus's legal team had tied up stronger cases before by burying them in procedural challenges and dragging them out until victims gave up. They needed someone inside Marcus's operation to flip, someone who could testify to the deliberate nature of the fraud, someone whose involvement was documented enough that their testimony would be unimpeachable. Natalie sat quietly for a moment, thinking through everyone in Marcus's orbit, and then she remembered Harold Simmons, the accountant who'd looked uncomfortable at the last company meeting, whose eyes had darted away when Marcus talked about the anniversary party plans. Harold knew where all the bodies were buried because he'd helped dig the graves. She had 40 days to convince him to talk. That same week, Marcus announced the anniversary party theme to their inner circle, celebrating 6 years of success, and the irony was so sharp Natalie almost laughed. That night, Marcus was unusually affectionate at dinner, reaching across the table to touch her hand in a gesture that might have looked tender to an outside observer but felt like a predator playing with prey. "I know I've been distant lately," he said, his voice warm and convincing. "But this party will change everything. I promise." His phone buzzed on the table between them, the screen lighting up with a message from Celeste that was visible for just 2 seconds. "Necklace ready for Saturday transfer." He didn't even try to hide it. He didn't flip the phone over or make an excuse. He just glanced at it and smiled, and Natalie understood in that moment just how broken he thought she was, how completely he believed she was too defeated to notice or care about anything anymore. After he left for another business trip at 8 p.m., claiming he needed to catch a late flight to Chicago, Natalie got in her car and drove to Harold Simmons's house on the other side of town. It was 11 p.m. when she parked across the street in the rain, watching the lights in his windows, seeing shadows move behind curtains, and trying to find the courage to walk up to his door and ask a man to destroy his own life to help save hers. What city are you in right now? Tell us below. If your heart is racing right now, subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller because Natalie's about to do something that will make Marcus's whole world crumble. And if you're still not subscribing, comment and tell us honestly, what would it take to earn your subscription? Drop fire if you're ready for Harold to spill everything. Natalie sat in her car for 17 minutes before she found the courage to cross the street and knock on Harold Simmons's door. When he answered at exactly 11:37 p.m., the shock on his face told her everything she needed to know. He'd been expecting this moment, dreading it, and now that it had arrived he looked almost relieved. His wife and teenage kids were asleep upstairs, and he pressed a finger to his lips, whispering urgently, "You shouldn't be here. If Marcus finds out..." But he stepped aside anyway, let her in, led her to the kitchen where the single overhead light created dramatic shadows that made both of them look older and more tired than they were. He made coffee, his hands shaking so badly the mugs rattled against the counter, and the coffee came out too strong because he'd measured wrong from nervousness. They sat across from each other at his kitchen table, rain drumming against the windows, the refrigerator humming in the background, the wall clock ticking too loudly in the silence between them. Harold already knew why she was there. The guilt on his face was the same guilt she'd seen in her own mirror for years, the guilt of knowing something was wrong and doing nothing about it. Natalie asked him just one question, her voice quiet but steady. "How do you sleep at night?" Harold broke down right there at his kitchen table, his hands covering his face, his shoulders shaking with sobs. He tried to muffle so his family wouldn't wake up. He admitted everything in a rush of words that seemed like they'd been building pressure for years. He'd been Marcus's accountant for 15 years, had handled the books for all 5 wives, had created the shell companies and structured the offshore accounts, and buried the paper trails that made Marcus's theft look like legitimate business. He kept detailed records the entire time, he confessed, detailed enough to prove everything but hidden away as an insurance policy in case Marcus ever turned on him the way he'd turned on everyone else. His family's mortgage was held by one of Marcus's subsidiary companies with terms that could be called at any time. His daughter's college fund was an investment, managed through Marcus's firm that could disappear with a single phone call. Harold had told himself for 15 years that he was just doing his job, that he wasn't responsible for what Marcus chose to do with the structures Harold created, that everyone in finance bent the rules, and this wasn't really different. But he knew it was different. He'd always known. Natalie didn't yell at him, didn't call him the names he probably deserved. Instead, she pulled out her phone and showed him photos of the previous victims, one by one, letting him see the faces of the people whose lives he'd helped destroy. Then Harold told her something that made the bottom drop out of Natalie's world all over again. Marcus wasn't just planning to divorce her and take everything. He was planning to frame her for embezzlement. After the public divorce announcement at the anniversary party, Marcus would claim that Natalie had been stealing from the company for years, that he discovered it recently, and was heartbroken by the betrayal. The forged documents were already prepared, Harold explained, his voice breaking. Fake bank transfers, showing money flowing from company accounts to overseas accounts under Natalie's digital signature, which Marcus's tech people had replicated perfectly. An evidence trail showing her stealing $600,000 over 3 years, carefully timed to coincide with periods when she'd actually been working at the company. She wouldn't just lose everything in the divorce. She'd face criminal charges. Marcus's lawyer had connections with the district attorney's office, and the case would be prosecuted aggressively as an example of corporate fraud. Harold had been instructed to testify at the anniversary party as the concerned accountant who discovered the theft, to stand up in front of 300 people and destroy what remained of Natalie's reputation before the police were called. Natalie's mouth went completely dry, and she could taste metal on her tongue like she'd bitten through her cheek. She hadn't seen this coming, hadn't planned for it, and for a moment the weight of it crushed the breath out of her lungs. Prison. Marcus had planned to send her to prison. Harold spread documents across his kitchen table with shaking hands, showing her the planted evidence. Bank transfer records with timestamps and digital signatures that looked exactly like hers, email correspondence that had never existed but looked completely real, financial reports with her name on the approval line for transfers she'd never authorized. The timeline was meticulous, showing a pattern of increasing theft that would be easy for a prosecutor to sell to a jury. Marcus had planned for every contingency. If Natalie tried to fight the divorce, he'd threaten her with prosecution. If she accepted the divorce terms quietly, he might let her walk away with nothing but at least her freedom. Either way, she'd be silenced completely, too afraid or too destroyed to ever speak about what he'd done. Harold's voice cracked as he looked at Natalie across his kitchen table. I have 3 kids upstairs. My daughter wants to be a teacher. My son just made the basketball team. But this is wrong. I know it's wrong. I've known it was wrong for 15 years, and I did it anyway because I was scared. He stood up, walked to a cabinet above the refrigerator, and pulled down a USB drive that had been hidden behind cereal boxes. He placed it in Natalie's hand. Everything. All the real files, all the real transactions, all the communications between Marcus and Celeste, all 5 previous victims. I can't do this anymore. Harold agreed to testify, to wear a wire at the anniversary party if that's what it took, to stand up in front of everyone and tell the truth instead of the lies Marcus had scripted for him. His only condition was witness protection for his family afterward, because Marcus's reach was long and his capacity for revenge was well documented. They had 35 days to build a case so airtight that Marcus couldn't slip through, couldn't hide more assets, couldn't destroy the evidence before it went public. Natalie left Harold's house at 1:47 a.m., the USB drive feeling like it weighed 10 pounds in her jacket pocket, like it was burning a hole through the fabric. She drove home through empty streets slick with rain, her mind racing through everything that needed to happen in the next 5 weeks. But when she pulled into her driveway, Marcus's car was there. He'd said he was flying to Chicago, but he was home, and every light in the house was off except for one lamp in the living room. Natalie walked through the front door and found him sitting in the dark, waiting, his face half-shadowed and his eyes reflecting the single lamp like a predator's. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but there was steel underneath. "Where were you, Natalie? It's almost 2 in the morning. What country are you watching from? Drop it below. If you're on the edge of your seat, subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller right now, because what happens in this conversation between Natalie and Marcus will leave you speechless. Not subscribing yet? Tell us in the comments what's holding you back. We genuinely want to understand. Drop fire if you're scared for Natalie right now." Marcus sat in his leather chair like he was holding court, a glass of scotch in his hand catching the amber glow from the street lamp outside, and his smile didn't reach his eyes at all. The room was dark except for that single source of light filtering through the window, creating long shadows that made the expensive furniture look menacing instead of elegant. Natalie could hear ice clinking in his glass every time he shifted position, could smell the leather of the chair and the scotch and something else underneath it all, the sharp scent of her own fear. Her pulse hammered in her ears, so loudly she was sure he could hear it. A car alarm went off somewhere in the distance, and the sound felt like a warning. Marcus took a slow sip of his drink, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, then spoke with that quiet intensity that had always been more frightening than yelling. "I asked you a question, Natalie. Where were you at midnight?" The USB drive in her jacket pocket felt like it weighed 100 pounds, like it was a bomb that could explode and destroy everything if he even suspected it existed. But the training from the past 4 weeks kicked in, all those hours in the library planning for exactly this moment, and Natalie forced herself to remember that she was an actress now, playing the most important role of her life. She let her face crumple, let the tears come, and they were controlled and calculated, but they looked real, because underneath the performance was genuine terror. Her voice came out broken and desperate, exactly the way he expected. "I've been driving around. I can't do this anymore, Marcus. The party, everyone watching us, pretending everything is perfect when it's not. I feel like I'm losing my mind." She watched his body language shift immediately, saw the tension leave his shoulders, because this was exactly the breakdown he'd been engineering for months. He stood up slowly, setting his glass down with deliberate care, and crossed the room toward her with an expression of fake concern that probably looked convincing if you didn't know him the way she'd learned to know him. His hand landed on her shoulder, heavy and possessive, and his voice dropped into that patronizing gentleness that made her skin crawl. "I know things have been hard for you lately, but this party is important for us, for the company, for everything we've built together. You just need to get through it, and then things will get better." She could smell Celeste's perfume on his shirt, fresh from tonight, and realized he'd been with her before coming home to interrogate his wife. Then Marcus did something that made Natalie's blood run cold, something she hadn't anticipated even though she should have. He offered her a deal, his voice taking on a tone of magnanimous generosity that was somehow more threatening than any direct accusation. "After the party, if you want to step away from everything, I'll help you. A fresh start somewhere else, away from all the pressure. We can make it easy for you." His eyes were calculating as he watched her face, measuring her reaction, and Natalie understood immediately what he was really offering. This was the embezzlement frame-up option, the choice between accepting total defeat in silence or facing criminal prosecution. He thought she was broken enough to take it, desperate enough to sign away whatever remained of her dignity in exchange for avoiding whatever horrors he'd planned. The scariest part was how reasonable he made it sound, like he was doing her a favor, like she should be grateful for his compassion. She forced herself to consider it, to play into his expectations completely, to make him believe his trap had worked. Natalie let relief flood her face, manufactured gratitude making her voice shake. "I just want this to be over. Whatever you think is best, Marcus. I trust you." The words tasted like poison in her mouth, but they had the desired effect. Marcus pulled her into a hug that felt less like comfort and more like a trap snapping shut around prey that had finally stopped struggling. His arms were tight around her, and he spoke directly into her ear with satisfaction coloring every word. "Good girl. The party will be very simple. You just smile, greet the guests, stand beside me. Then we can end this whole difficult chapter and both move forward." He released her and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small prescription bottle that rattled when he shook it. 2 white pills tumbled into his palm, and he pressed them into her hand. For your nerves. Start taking these daily until the party. They'll help you stay calm, help you get through it without any more of these late-night drives that worry me so much. Natalie palmed the pills, already planning to have them analyzed because she suspected they were sedatives designed to keep her docile and compliant, maybe even confused enough that she wouldn't notice what was happening until it was too late. Marcus went upstairs to bed, satisfied that he'd secured her compliance, probably already texting Celeste about how perfectly the confrontation had gone. Natalie stood alone in the dark living room, still holding the pills in her clenched fist, the USB drive heavy in her jacket pocket. She pulled out the burner phone she'd hidden in the garage and sent Victor a text message that said simply, "He's moving faster. We have 3 weeks max." That night, she couldn't sleep, her mind racing through everything that needed to happen and everything that could go wrong. At 3 a.m, she went to the bathroom and opened the medicine cabinet looking for something to help her think more clearly, and that's when she found them. An entire bottle of the same pills Marcus had given her, already prescribed in her name, with a label that said anxiety medication and a date from 2 years ago. The signature on the prescription form was hers, but she'd never signed it, had never even seen it before tonight. Marcus had been planning her mental breakdown for years, creating a paper trail of instability that would make his divorce narrative believable, that would make people think she'd always been fragile and difficult. The bottle sat in her hand like evidence of just how long he'd been playing this game, and Natalie realized that every single moment of her 6-year marriage had been choreographed toward this ending. Where on earth are you watching this? Comment your location. If you're feeling that rage building, smash that subscribe button for Olivia the Storyteller because the anniversary party is 3 weeks away and everything is about to explode. Still not subscribing? At least tell us why in the comments. What's your reason? Drop fire if you want Natalie to destroy Marcus's entire plan. The anniversary party at the Vandermeer Hotel ballroom was exactly as Marcus had planned it, down to the last crystal champagne flute and the exact positioning of the 300 guests who'd come to witness what they thought would be Natalie's public humiliation. It was 9:43 p.m. when Marcus made his announcement, standing on the small stage with his business partner beside him holding a microphone, both of them performing their rehearsed roles perfectly. The divorce papers were in his lawyer's hands, ready to be presented with maximum theatrical impact. But this time, Natalie wasn't the terrified woman who discovered the plan too late. She was the woman who'd spent 3 months preparing for exactly this moment, and everything she'd learned, everything she documented, everything she'd sacrificed to get here had led to these next 10 minutes. The smell of champagne made her nauseous. Camera flashes from dozens of phones made spots dance in her vision. Silk rustled as guests shifted to get better views, but her heart beat steady and strong in her chest. Celeste stood 30 feet away, wearing Natalie's grandmother's emerald necklace, smirking with the confidence of someone who thought the game was already won. Security guards positioned themselves strategically around Natalie, and Marcus's lawyer had his phone out, recording everything for the legal proceedings he thought were coming. Marcus approached her with that check for $50,000. His voice pitched perfectly to carry across the silent ballroom where even the orchestra had stopped playing. "I've supported her long enough. It's time for both of us to move forward. Natalie, take this and leave with some dignity intact." The guests whispered to each other, their phones recording every second, though some of them looked uncomfortable with the spectacle, like they knew they were watching something cruel even if they couldn't quite bring themselves to intervene. Emma was crying in the crowd, pushing against Marcus's friends who blocked her path, reaching toward Natalie with desperate hands. Marcus extended the check toward her with his other hand raised in a gesture that was meant to look magnanimous, the performance of a generous husband who'd been pushed to his limit by a difficult wife. 10 full seconds of silence passed while Natalie just looked at him, not at the check, not at the papers, just directly into his eyes. She didn't take the check. She didn't cry. She didn't move at all. And in that stillness, something shifted in the room, a subtle change in energy that Marcus registered too late as the first sign that his script wasn't being followed. Then Natalie spoke, and her voice was clear and steady, carrying across the ballroom without needing amplification. "Thank you, Marcus, for gathering everyone here tonight. I appreciate you making this so public because I have something to share too." His face flickered with confusion, just for a second, before his practiced smile returned. But it was too late. This wasn't the script he'd written, and he had no backup plan for a wife who wasn't broken. Natalie reached into her small black clutch and pulled out a folded document, the same one that had been there all night, the same one she'd placed on the gift table in that original moment before she'd walked out. But the audience watching now understood what it was, understood the weight of what she was about to do. She wasn't signing his divorce papers. She wasn't accepting his charity. She was presenting her own documentation, and she placed it carefully on the gift table where everyone could see. A federal investigation notice with Marcus Whitfield's name printed in bold letters across the top, along with case numbers and dates that showed this wasn't a bluff or a desperate attempt at leverage. Natalie explained everything calmly, while 300 guests listened in complete silence, their phones still recording but now capturing something entirely different than what they'd expected. 5 years of documented fraud, she told them. 12 previous victims beyond the 2 ex-wives everyone had whispered about. $47 million stolen through schemes that spanned a dozen years and 3 cities. The FBI had been investigating for 3 months with her full cooperation, building a case that was now complete and ready for prosecution. Harold Simmons stepped forward from where he'd been standing in the crowd, his face pale but his voice firm as he announced that he was testifying against Marcus, that he had all the real financial records, that everything Natalie was saying was true and documented. Victor Remington emerged from another section of the crowd with professional recording equipment and a folder thick with documents, explaining that his investigative report had already been submitted to the SEC and would be published in tomorrow's paper. Marcus's face went completely white, all the blood draining away as he realized what was happening. Celeste moved toward the exit, trying to slip away in the confusion, but she wasn't fast enough. Federal agents entered the ballroom at exactly 9:52 p.m., right on schedule, their badges visible as they walked through the stunned crowd toward Marcus. 300 guests and 300 phones recorded every moment as Marcus Whitfield was arrested in his own anniversary party, handcuffed in front of everyone he'd wanted to impress, everyone he gathered to witness his victory. Celeste was stopped at the door by 2 more agents, also arrested as a co-conspirator in 12 years of coordinated fraud. One of the agents carefully removed the emerald necklace from Celeste's neck and handed it to Natalie. The family heirloom returned to its rightful owner while cameras flashed and recorded and turned this moment into something that would be shared thousands of times before the night was over. Marcus looked at Natalie as the agents read him his rights, his expression shifting from shock to rage to something that might have been respect if he were capable of that emotion. His last words to her, spoken loud enough for everyone to hear, were exactly what she'd expected. "You couldn't have done this." Natalie's response was quiet, but every phone in the room caught it. Every recording preserved it. "I learned from the best. You taught me how to plan, Marcus. You taught me how to be patient and thorough and how to make sure every detail was perfect before I made my move." Then she walked toward the exit, her heels clicking on marble with that same steady rhythm from the opening scene, her head high, her back straight, her hands holding her grandmother's necklace instead of divorce papers. The cameras flashed around her, phones recorded her exit, but this time they weren't documenting her humiliation. They were recording her victory, and the footage would go viral by morning, spreading the truth about Marcus Whitfield faster than his lawyers could ever hope to contain it. Where are you watching from? Drop your location right now. If you're feeling that satisfaction, subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller immediately because the final part reveals what happens to Marcus and how Natalie rebuilds. And if you still won't subscribe after this, comment below and tell us honestly what's wrong. We need to know. Drop fire, fire, fire if justice was served. 3 months after that anniversary party became the most watched viral video of the year, Natalie stood in her father's old office for the first time in 6 years, and everything felt different. The company sign above the door read Richford Solutions again, her father's name restored to the building he built with 30 years of honest work. The office smelled like fresh paint and new carpet, the kind of clean slate scent that comes with genuine new beginnings. Her morning coffee tasted better somehow, like she could finally taste it properly without the constant metallic edge of fear in her mouth. Birds sang outside the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city, and the morning light made everything feel possible again. The walls that had once held Marcus's awards and achievements now displayed photos of the people who actually mattered. Her father in his early days starting the company, her grandmother wearing that emerald necklace at her own wedding, and the 47 employees who'd stayed loyal through everything, who'd testified when asked, who'd waited patiently for the truth to come out. Through the glass wall that separated her office from the main floor, she could see Harold Simmons at his desk, now serving as CFO of a company that operated with complete transparency, every transaction documented and available for audit. The local news played softly on the television in the corner, covering Marcus's trial with the same intensity they'd once used to cover his supposed business success. Marcus Whitfield pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering to avoid an even longer sentence, and the judge gave him 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole before serving at least 8. Celeste Brennan pleaded guilty as a co-conspirator and received 8 years, with additional requirements to return all assets obtained from previous schemes and to cooperate fully in locating other victims. All 12 victims that Victor's investigation had uncovered were contacted and included in a restitution fund established from the recovered assets, and 2 of them were Marcus's previous wives who were finally coming forward publicly, finally beginning the healing process they'd been denied for years. Natalie testified at the sentencing hearing, standing in front of the judge in the packed courtroom to read a statement she'd written and rewritten a dozen times. Marcus Whitfield taught me something valuable, though not what he intended. He taught me that I was stronger than his lies, smarter than his manipulation, and more resilient than he could ever imagine. He thought he could break me, but instead he forged me into someone who will spend the rest of her life making sure no one else goes through what I did. Her company was fully restored, every stolen asset returned, and the court awarded her $4.7 million in damages on top of everything else, money that Marcus would be paying back for the rest of his life. Then came the moment that changed everything again, the revelation that Natalie hadn't planned for and didn't know how to feel about at first. 6 weeks after the trial, she discovered she was pregnant, the timing making it clear this had happened in those final weeks before the separation, before everything exploded. She was initially terrified, sitting in her doctor's office staring at the test results and thinking about how this meant a permanent connection to Marcus, a reminder of him that would last her entire life. But her sister Emma came over that night and held her hands across the kitchen table and said something that shifted Natalie's entire perspective. This baby is yours, not his. Your body, your choice, your life. But if you decide to keep this baby, just remember that children aren't their parents. This baby didn't do anything wrong. This baby can be proof that you can build a family on your own terms, that you can create something good even from the worst circumstances. Natalie decided to keep the baby, to raise the child alone without Marcus's name or influence or money, and as the months passed, she found unexpected peace in the decision. The baby wasn't Marcus's legacy. The baby was proof that Natalie could take even this and transform it into something that belonged entirely to her, something Marcus could never touch or claim or ruin. The company thrived in ways it never had under Marcus's leadership, growing to 73 employees within a year, building a culture of integrity and transparency that attracted the kind of clients who valued ethics as much as profit. Harold's family spent 6 weeks in witness protection before being safely resettled in a nearby town where his daughter enrolled in the college of her dreams with a full scholarship from a program Natalie created specifically to support children whose parents had done the right thing at great personal cost. Victor Remington's investigative series about Marcus and Celeste's schemes won a National Journalism Award and led to the exposure of 5 similar operations across the country, operations that had been running unchecked for years because no one had connected the patterns. New laws were passed strengthening protections against coercive financial abuse, with provisions specifically designed to help victims escape before losing everything. Even Natalie's mother finally came to see her, sitting in that same office where so many things had gone wrong and gone right, and said the words Natalie had needed to hear for years. "I should have listened to you. I should have believed you. I'm so sorry I didn't stand by you when you needed me most." 18 months after that night at the Vandermeer Hotel, Natalie stood in the company's main conference room during the annual Employee Appreciation Celebration she'd started hosting, a party that had nothing to do with anniversaries and everything to do with recognizing the people who made Richford Solutions what it was. Her daughter was on her hip, 6 months old and named Charlotte after the grandmother who'd warned Natalie to never sign what she didn't read. Emma was there, and Harold's whole family, and Victor who'd become a genuine friend, and all the employees who believed in her when she'd had nothing but hope and determination. Natalie's phone rang in her pocket, and when she pulled it out, Marcus's name flashed on the screen, his prison phone privileges allowing him one last attempt to insert himself into her life. She declined the call without hesitation, without even a moment of doubt, and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Charlotte reached out and touched the restored Richford Solutions sign on the wall, her tiny fingers tracing the letters, and Natalie whispered to her daughter, "Your grandfather built this company with honor. I fought to keep it that way, and someday if you want it, it's yours. But whether you want it or not, you'll always know that dignity and courage matter more than anything else." She looked out the window at the city lights beginning to sparkle as dusk fell, and for the first time in 6 years, she could breathe freely. The past didn't own her anymore. She owned her future, and it was beautiful. You made it to the end. What city, state, or country are you in? Drop it below right now. If this story moved you, if you felt every moment of Natalie's journey, then you owe it to yourself to subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller. We bring you stories like this every single week. Stories of strength, justice, and people who refuse to stay down. And if you're still not subscribing after watching Natalie's complete journey, comment below and tell us honestly what's stopping you. What would make you finally hit that button? This community is 50,000 strong and growing. Don't be the one who misses out on next week's story. Drop fire if Natalie is your hero. Drop red heart if you believe in second chances. And subscribe if you want more stories that prove dignity and courage always win.